I open this public session of the Council of Deans from the Christian origins of the VU Amsterdam to the polychromatic academic community that we are today. Our scientific practice is intertwined with fundamental values and the sense of wonder. Welcome, everyone, here in our aula, as well as at the live stream. We come together to mark the public acceptance by Pepijn Brandon of the chair in Global Economic and Social History in the Faculty of Humanities at our university. Let me briefly introduce our speaker. Pepijn Brandon was born and raised in Amsterdam, and he studied social and economic history at the University of Amsterdam. At that university, he also defended 10 years ago his PhD thesis on state, capital, and military enterprise in the Dutch cycle of accumulation between 1600 and 1775. Supervised by Marjolein het Hart, Leo Noordegraaf, and Marcel van der Linden. This was followed by a combination of 2 part-time appointments at the International Institute of Social History and our university at the same time, intersected with research positions at the World History Center at the University of Pittsburgh, a visiting fellowship in the context of the Weatherhead Initiative on Global History at Harvard, as well as a visiting professorship at the History Department at Harvard, and regular visits at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University in Providence. The latter has led to an international project on race, slavery, colonialism, and the making of global capitalism. It's against this background that since February last year, Brandon combines a part-time research position of 1 day a week at the International Institute of Social History with the chair of Global Economic and Social History in our Faculty of Humanities. With this combination, Brandon continues a long and fruitful history of academic collaboration and exchange between our 2 institutions. So we also feel at home at the IISH, all of us historians, and a special welcome here to our IISH colleagues at this inaugural event of a colleague who is also your professor. Brandon is dedicated to our education programs, both as the director of Humanities Research Master Program of our graduate school and at all other levels of the history programs in our faculty. I've often been impressed by his wide range of knowledge and didactic skills in his classes in a variety of topics way beyond the specific profile of this chair. In the course of the last years, Brandon has become a leading scholar in research on the involvement of various well-established institutions in Dutch colonialism and their relationship to the enterprise of Dutch slave trade, slavery, forced labor, and wage labor. This work focuses at financial institutions, such as the predecessors of ABN AMRO, on political bodies like the Amsterdam City Council, or on industrial sites like shipyards. These are not mere case studies, they are embedded in a strong analytical approach to economic and social histories, maritime history, history of land use and agriculture. In these fields, Brandon is an active convener of and participant in conferences among a wide network of international scholars. Such research, both commissioned by institutional stakeholders and awarded by the major research funds, is relevant in the context of societal debates that urges to acknowledge the deep legacies of the colonial past in contemporary society. Brandon is committed to this societal development and to translate such research to a wider audience, as speaks as well from his advisory role in exhibition projects by a wide range of museums and libraries in the Netherlands and abroad, or his contribution to public debates on the contested contemporary relationships to the colonial past. But let me stop here with this short introduction of our speaker. And I would like to invite you, Pepijn Brandon, to take over with your inaugural lecture entitled Elements of Original Accumulation, Dispossession, War and Slavery in the History of Capitalism.
Geachte rector, beste aanwezigen. I will first say a couple of words in Dutch. Allereerst heel kort over de muziek die u zojuist gehoord heeft. Henk Verhoef bespeelde voor u het Couperin-orgel. Bij uw binnenkomst speelde hij fragmenten uit de Franse suite nummer 5 van Johann Sebastian Bach. Tijdens de entree van het cortège speelde hij Thomas Preston's 16e eeuwse compositie Upon La Mirée. Een mysterieus en wat onheimisch stuk dat voor mijn gevoel ook gisteren geschreven had kunnen zijn. Bij het verlaten van de zaal, na afloop, zal Henk Verhoef tot mijn grote genoegen een moderne improvisatie verzorgen op basis van mijn lezing, waarvoor hij de grote geluiden van het orgel zal benutten. Het grand jeu of het plein jeu. U zult begrijpen, in het komende uur is dat waar ik het meeste naar uitkijk. Dankjewel, Henk. Ik zou heel graag deze reden in het geheel in het Nederlands houden, maar mijn collega's, studenten en vrienden komen van over de hele wereld. Met het oog op hen zal ik van hieraf dus in het Engels spreken. Voor wie dat wil, is in een beperkte oplage een Nederlandse vertaling beschikbaar, die u na afloop van mij kunt krijgen. From here on, I will continue this lecture in English. As you can see from the title slide, I aim to keep things light and breezy. An inaugural lecture is a means of paying homage. The time-tested format that reflects this aim is to start with intellectual debts. From there, the incumbent professor works their way up to a more personal set of obligations towards colleagues who help them along the way. The final minutes are reserved for a private note of gratitude towards friend and family. But in this case, the central intellectual debt from which I want to start my exploration of the relationship between capitalism and large-scale violence has its origin in family history. Sometime in my early teens, my grandmother, Mirjam Oeringer, told me a story involving her father, Herman Oeringer, who by that time had already entered his 90s. In 1917, he had fled Galicia, the war-torn region straddling present-day Poland and Ukraine. Via Berlin, he found his way to the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam. There he had been among the first members of the Yiddish workers' cultural circle Sharansky, named after the great modernist author. The pride of this left-wing cultural association was its carefully curated library. When the Netherlands was brought under Nazi occupation, as a precaution against the gathering storm of persecution, Herman partook in the undoubtedly traumatic act of destroying the library. However, as my grandmother relayed to me half a century later, he could not stomach to destroy the library's single copy of the Yiddish translation of Marx's Capital, Volume 1. Instead, he took it home. According to my grandmother, he would wake her up in the middle of the night to read her passages that he found inspiring or difficult. Herman died when I was almost 15. And in my mind, the most fitting tribute was to read this book that he had found important enough to rescue it from the flames. I imagine I had as much trouble understanding the text as my great-grandfather on those 1940 nights. But I was completely enthralled by the famous final chapters. Here, Marx, in sweeping strokes, sketches the whirlwind of persecution, war, dispossession, slavery, and colonialism that accompanied the rise of capitalist production. I here give Marx's own summary of this process in its most frequently used English translation. On screen, you will also see the Dutch version in which I first read this. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population of that continent, the beginnings of the conquest and plunder of the East Indies, and the conversion of Africa into a preserve for the commercial hunting of blackskins are all things which characterize the dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. Hard on their heels follows the commercial war of the European nations, which has the globe as its battlefield. It begins with a revolt of the Netherlands from Spain, assumes gigantic dimensions in England's anti-Jacobin war, and is still going on in the shape of the Opium Wars against China, etc. Perceptive members of the audience will notice that there are several significant differences between the two translations. You will have to take my word for it that the Dutch translation in this case presents us with a more faithful rendering of the German original. I have marked in bold the differences. That doesn't work, but I've marked it in bold. The difference with the deepest consequences for our approach to the history of capitalism. The transposition of momenta or elements into moments in the line from which the title of this lecture is taken. Consciously or subconsciously, my own choices of topics as a historian have continued to circle the events outlined here. In the past 15 years, I have worked on the waves of rural dispossession during the Dutch Revolt, the financial subsystems that enabled the commercial wars between the European nations, the resistance of workers to the introduction of industrial labor practices in military industries, and the importance of slavery for the Dutch economy and for the development of capitalism in general. In this lecture, I do not intend to present you with a detailed discussion of any of these historical episodes as moments or elements of original accumulation. Rather, I want to share with you some of the ways in which these investigations have led me to reconsider fundamental questions raised by this passage. These also happen to be central problems in the history of capitalism, problems positioned at the heart of the research agenda I aim to develop further as chair. Original accumulation is never properly defined by Marx. From its usage in Capital, it is clear that the term denotes at least two processes. One is the separation of immediate producers from the means of production. Capitalist labor relations arise out of the dispossession of communal landholders, self-sufficient peasants, or petty commodity producers. However, as the passage cited earlier suggests, there is a second, complementary aspect, the original enrichment through which future capitalists acquire the funds needed to set capital accumulation in motion. Finally, as Marcel van der Linden rightly insists, these two processes cannot simply sit side by side. They need to be brought together. As Marx explains, the epoch-making events in this process are, quote, when great masses of human beings are suddenly and forcibly torn from their means of subsistence and hurled onto the labor market as free, unprotected, and rightless proletarians. End of quotation. The theoretical need for a concept like original accumulation, however, arises from a more mundane, everyday aspect of capital accumulation, its circular nature. A functioning capitalist economy seems to create capital out of capital, commodities out of commodities, in perpetual movement. For the movement itself to be established, one has to assume, in the words of Marx, an accumulation which is not the result of the capitalist mode of production, but its point of departure. End quote. To further complicate matters, Marx immediately throws a shade of doubt over the validity of this search for a prior point of departure by speaking of the so-called original accumulation. Rather than solving the outstanding issue of a point of departure that is only so-called original, Marx stages a flight into history. He does so in a series of breathtakingly speculative chapters that connect events across continents and centuries. Marx's method here is powerfully suggestive and in no way satisfies criteria of proof that historians commonly employ. Which is why everyone in this audience knows exactly what historians like myself have had to say about the roots of capital accumulation, while Karl Marx remained an obscure and never-read 19th century philosopher. The concept of original accumulation has made a spectacular comeback in the 21st century. Usually referred to in its unfortunate translation as primitive accumulation, sociologists, social geographers, political scientists, and many others have employed it to understand phenomena ranging from the subjugation of women through early modern witch trials to the roots of capitalism's destructive relationship with nature. For social geographer David Harvey, original accumulation, redubbed accumulation by dispossession, can cover almost any aspect of capitalism in its neoliberal phase. Likewise, a recent article in The Guardian explained that, cite, AI image and text generation is pure primitive accumulation, expropriation of labor from the many for the enrichment and advancement of a few Silicon Valley technology companies and their billionaire owners. End of quotation. In this most expansive reading, original accumulation becomes indistinguishable from accumulation per se, and thereby also loses all its analytical value. Authors who do want to distinguish original accumulation from regular capital accumulation fall into two groups. The first sees it as the historical antecedent for the establishment of full capitalism, and therefore as a moment belonging to capitalism's prehistory. The second sees it as an ongoing expression of capitalism's frontiers, where regions or spheres that previously remained outside of capitalism are being integrated into the logic of capital accumulation. The historic sequence here remains intact, but it is acknowledged that different parts of the world can find themselves in different stages of capitalist development. The perspective that I will advance here diverges significantly from all three positions. Against authors like Harvey, I maintain that original accumulation should indeed be understood as the starting point of regular accumulation. But against the two more mainstream readings of original accumulation, I insist on the need of a radical break from the idea that this starting point can only precede capitalist development. The flight into history makes the section on original accumulation the most accessible part of Marx's Capital. But it comes at a heavy price. Until recently, almost everyone took for granted that Marx's original accumulation refers to the birth story of capitalism. Violence is key to the accumulation of wealth under conditions where markets do not function or function imperfectly. Once real, mature capitalism gets off the ground, accumulation through purely economic mechanisms takes the place of dispossession, war, and slavery. Violence becomes at most a support mechanism for otherwise economically driven expansion. Translating original as primitive and misreading momenta, elements, or methods as temporal moments further solidified this process of historical distancing. In a strange way, this has attached the work of highly orthodox Marxists to very mainstream readings of the history of capitalism. This version could even be embraced by our decidedly non-Marxist Prime Minister Rutte. We can acknowledge that at some point in history, commercial societies enrich themselves through dispossession, war, and slavery. One can even offer formal apologies for this, as long as we are clear that we are talking about the past, not the present. In the last decade, a wave of new scholarship, often bracketed under the heading of the new history of capitalism, has challenged the idea that colonization, slavery, and war are somehow extrinsic to the logic of capital proper. Not surprisingly, debates have been most intense around the question of capitalism and slavery, first raised as long ago as 1944 by the Trinidadian historian Eric Williams. So far, most authors identified with the new history of capitalism have shied away from the descent into the gaping depths of Marx's theory of accumulation, preferring to discuss similar problems using different terms. Let me briefly try. In 1762, the prominent merchants Thomas Hope, his son John Hope, and his nephew Henry Hope founded the Amsterdam-based firm Hope & Co. At its peak in the early 1790s, the firm had an annual turnover at the Amsterdam Bank of Exchange of 76 million guilders, roughly equivalent to 800 million euros today. Hope & Co. far surpassed other financial and trading companies operating in Amsterdam or London in scale, probably making it the largest private company of its day. The reputation of the firm was unrivaled. When in 1772, British Parliament discussed opening up the British plantation colonies to foreign investment, Les Messieurs Hope were mentioned as prime example. In 1786, Adam Smith dedicated the 4th edition of The Wealth of Nations to his gentleman informant, Mr. Henry Hope of Amsterdam. The spectacular rise of Hope & Co. has usually been ascribed to its role in financing the crowned heads of Europe through the escalating wars of the late 18th century. However, as the financial reconstructions made by Patrick van der Geest, Gerhard de Kok, and myself have shown, revenues from global trade in slave-produced commodities and investment in the plantation sector took precedence over state loans in their 18th century success. Both in 1770 and in 1790, anywhere between a quarter and a third of Hope & Co.'s entire income was derived from slavery, mostly the Caribbean plantation complex. Furthermore, state loans to finance war were often undergirded by deals that gave Hope & Co. access to new branches of slavery-based commodity trade, such as the trade in diamonds or tobacco. After the turn of the 19th century, the company lost some of its luster, but it still played a major role in history. Hope & Co. raised the capital for the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, funded railways in the US North and a plantation bank in the US South, and bankrolled the Russian Tsars. If there ever was a single company that combined in its operations all the main elements of original accumulation, it was Hope & Co. However, there was nothing primitive about the way Hope & Co. functioned. Through its meticulously administered investments, it linked slave plantations producing cash crops for the world market, global trade networks backed up by the naval might of European states, emerging consumer markets in the European interior, and complicated financial dealings with states and private firms. Hope & Co. certainly manipulated markets and used its connections to powerful states to gain advantages over competitors. But so do today's shipping firms, oil companies, arms dealers, and banks. Like many modern firms, Hope & Co. preferred involvement at a distance over direct responsibility on the ground. However, where the firm found it necessary for the protection of its profits, it used its financial leverage to reshape the immediate processes of production as well. The plantations overseen by the firm were among the largest, most rationalized units of production of their time, ruthlessly subjecting enslaved Africans and nature to the demands of profits emanating from overseas investors. Generally, the elements of original accumulation became globally connected through the highly recognizable and regular capital accumulation of firms like Hope & Co. It is possible to even go one step further. Dispossession, war, and slavery have all existed for millennia. They promulgated the development of capitalism only where and when their organization started to happen by capitalist means, with states and firms acting through increasingly efficient markets, employing well-defined individual property rights and contract law, extracting perfectly regular profits from irregular acts of destruction. Effective original accumulation, in short, requires the development of capitalism. The suggestion that methods of original accumulation arise from capital accumulation clashes with mainstream readings of Marx's Capital. However, the idea might be a bit less unorthodox than it seems. From 1872 to 1875, Marx oversaw the serialized French translation of Capital Volume 1. In addition to giving the world the ill-fated translation of Ursprüngliche Accumulation as Accumulation Primitive, he introduced many changes that he hoped would find their way into later German editions. Immediately after the famous passage outlining the main elements of original accumulation, he added a few cryptic words, describing them as les différentes méthodes d'accumulation primitive que l'ère capitaliste fait éclore, the different methods of original accumulation that the capitalist era brings to hatch. The words have never made it back into German or English editions, and understandably so. Here, the egg has laid a chicken. The methods supposedly laying the basis for the capitalist era are themselves born from the capitalist era. Quite apart from the perhaps immaterial issue, what Marx meant or did not mean, there is an important question to ask that affects all readings of the history of capitalism, Marxist and non-Marxist alike. It is not hard to grasp why the violence of original accumulation took place at enormous scale and with immense convulsions during the period when capitalist relations first spread across the globe. But why would the phenomenon be confined to the moment of birth? Every major new cycle of capital accumulation that does not simply continue already established accumulation requires the reassemblage of commodified labor power and capital out of elements that are inherently not capital. Mere money, nature, human beings. Feminist thinker Nancy Fraser calls these capitalism's background conditions. Cannibalizing these background conditions is a continuous aspect of capitalism's spasmodic pattern of expansion. Whether or not brute force plays a central role and in what shape will depend on many factors. To give just one obvious example, plantation slavery as a key mechanism in the course of the 19th century was largely replaced by other forms of racialized coerced labor. It is also true that the most brutal acts of expropriation have fallen disproportionately on the global south, on people of color, on women, and on those otherwise deemed less. However, it is important to note that historically, no capitalist society has proven immune to major relapses into primordial violence that reshaped the conditions of accumulation. During such catastrophic events, the existing social fabric is torn apart, and essentially new accumulative processes are started out of the debris of these destructive acts. The current wave of global land grabs can serve as an illustration. The massive transfer of farmland in the global south and beyond to investors from the US, EU, China, and the Gulf states echoes earlier episodes in history, such as the British enclosures or European settler colonialism. Contemporary land grabs often use legal and practical instruments drawn directly from an older colonial repertoire. However, such historic motives are fully intertwined with hyper-modern impulses. The growing demand for biofuels and soy, the wish to offset carbon emissions in the rich countries by planting trees on cheap land in Africa or Latin America, or financial firms' voracious quest for land as stable asset in the midst of global financial turmoil. Neither is it true that land grabs are simply outside impositions on non-capitalistically operating local societies. Peasant communities that are faced with land grabbing in many cases have been oriented towards the world market for decades or centuries. Nevertheless, the capital accumulation established in, say, the deforestation zones of Brazil or Indonesia is not simply a further evolution of such prior market systems. It proceeds from their destruction and replacement. Nature, human beings, and money are violently thrown out of the structures of accumulation in which they were previously embedded, before some of the shards of this process are then reassembled to start accumulation on new foundations. Race-making and gendering in this context as well are not just remnants of a past, but are the continuously reinvented sorting mechanisms to determine who is fit for use and who can be discarded. The destruction of the living conditions of indigenous peoples of the Amazon through Bolsonaro's new gold rush, the eviction of Indian peasant communities for the establishment of special exporting zones, the dispossession of Palestinian villages by the Israeli army to make way for economically thriving Jewish settlements, the mass displacement through the tsunami that opened up prime location for wealthy tourists, the destruction of Iraq or Ukraine by brutal invading armies and their future reconstruction by private companies. None of these phenomena are simply the result of capital accumulation in the narrow sense. They are politically constituted acts of dispossession. At the same time, they are the intentional or unintentional, environmentally, socially, and politically disruptive methods that form the sources of new streams of accumulation. They are continuously recurring elements of original accumulation. How is such recurring original accumulation related to historical capitalism? For the sake of clarification, let me ask a strange question. Was there a moment of original accumulation on the Banda Islands? Every school child in the Netherlands ought to know that in 1621, the VOC committed genocide on the small groups of islands to secure a monopoly in the trade in nutmeg and maize. Guided by an explicit policy of depopulation and repopulation, the word used by the VOC, Jan Pieterszoon Koen led the expulsion and murder of the existing inhabitants. Their replacements were to work as enslaved laborers on privately run nutmeg gardens. Certainly, here we have the beginning of the conquest and plunder of the East Indies that Marx singled out as one of the main elements of original accumulation. For the author Amitav Ghosh, it even is the single event that encapsulates the entire past, present, and future of the capitalist order. Looked at from the perspective of global capital accumulation, this might be true. But looked at from the Banda Islands, to take 1621 as the definitive moment of capitalist integration is not so self-evident. Yes, Koen transformed the island economy into a militarized encampment serving the VOC's thirst for profits. Nevertheless, the nutmeg tree, those Bandanese who were brought back to the islands as slaves, and the organization of the household remained highly resilient to attempts at rationalization according to capitalist norms. Arguably, it was only the abolition of slavery in 1860 and the simultaneous end of the monopoly in the spice trade that allowed for a further round of capitalist transformation of the Banda plantation. This, by the way, does not imply a complete shift to wage labor. The Dutch colonial government secured a steady stream of indentured laborers and convicts to work the nutmeg gardens. After independence, the rise of competing areas of nutmeg production and the abolition of colonial forced labor systems led to the reconstitution of small-scale peasant production on the Banda Islands. While the island economy at no point after 1621 could be described as traditional or independent of global capitalism, a further moment of original accumulation might in fact still be situated in the future. In order to stimulate economic development, policymakers are currently designing concrete plans to establish nutmeg processing factories, to expand the airstrip on Bandanera to allow for regular traffic, and to include Banda in new forms of heritage tourism under the umbrella of the government's Jalur Rempa, the Spice Route Plan. Many on the islands welcome such initiatives, but there also are well-grounded fears that in their wake will come all the classical byproducts of original accumulation: the destruction of the environment and existing culture, the buying up of waterfront property by foreign investors, and new social, ethnic, and political tensions. Traditional Marxists, but certainly not they alone, have always approached capital accumulation as an all-encompassing and irreversible process. Marx's 19th century belief in progress often led him to overestimate the speed and completeness with which industrial capital would subject every corner of the globe and all spheres of the economy. However, throughout his work, there is a sometimes latent, sometimes explicit counter-narrative. Hesitation increased exponentially in Marx's later years, creating enormous intellectual obstacles for finishing his magnum opus Capital. 20th century official Marxism forgot Marx's doubts. Fusing the class struggle with state-led developmentalism, it re-enshrined the belief that large-scale industry and industrial agriculture would devour everything that came onto their paths. In this linear view, original accumulation can indeed be nothing but a singular moment. Those who rejected this limited approach, starting with Rosa Luxemburg's brilliant Die Accumulation des Kapitals, usually argued that the ongoing nature of original accumulation arises from capital's geographic expansion into non-capitalist regions. Integrating global capitalism's peripheries can continue for a long time. The world is a large place. Nevertheless, complete subsumption under capital's logic remains the only possible and definitive outcome. The main challenges to such a one-directional reading of the history of capitalism have come from Marxist feminists and from authors from the former colonial world. Feminists have insisted that capitalist development was in fact accompanied by the rise of the privatized household as a massive repository of unpaid female labor, responsible for the social reproduction behind capitalism's production. Writers from the former colonies explained that what metropolitan observers lazily interpreted as the resilience of traditional modes of production or feudal remnants often only arose as a result of colonial capitalism. Thus, both groups challenge the idea that capitalist development exclusively stimulates the spread of industrial wage labor. With the usual arrogance, these insights were at best accepted as contributions to particularized grievances. They elucidated the women's problem or the question of underdevelopment. That they meant something for our understanding of the origins and process of capital accumulation itself was unthinkable. What if instead we take this critique seriously? What if the result of capitalist accumulation is not just more accumulation, but also its opposite, the creation of large reservoirs of non-accumulation? We can recognize this in the case of the Banda Islands, where all the elements of so-called traditionality were products of or responses to global capital. This case is, of course, not unique. In the vast informal sectors, slums and refugee camps of today's neoliberal world, we can trace the institution of new forms of non-remunerated and non-accumulative labor. Throughout the history of capitalism, alongside expanding accumulation, we find deindustrialization, mass unemployment, and depeasantization to continuously reinvent the independent petty commodity producer. Capitalist development is thus not merely built on original accumulation, but also reproduces its preconditions. To investigate the methods by which capitalism lays the foundations for original accumulation is an entire research program in its own right, one that I hope to extend and deepen in the coming years. The political implications are large. It has become quite common to acknowledge that we live in a new age of catastrophe, leading to wildly apocalyptic predictions on the future end of capitalism. However, without the development of democratic, egalitarian, and sustainable alternatives to capitalism, every catastrophe, in reality, might provide just another method for starting accumulation afresh. I hope you will allow me, at the end of this lecture, to return to my great-grandfather Herman. The First World War brought unprecedented pogroms to the shtetl of Galicia, only surpassed by their complete eradication a quarter century later. In the fall of 1914, the writer Sharansky wrote down the following: "A region in which only yesterday 1 million Jews enjoyed human and civil rights was suddenly enclosed within a ring of fire, blood, and steel. They were cut off and at the mercy of frenzied and violent soldiers and Cossacks who attacked them, like packs of wild animals. Many people believed that the entire Jewish population of Galicia was about to be destroyed. Many thinkers, starting with Aimé Césaire in his Discourse on Colonialism, have pointed out the continuities between Europe's 20th century descent into racial barbarism and the long history of European colonialism and slavery. For those caught up in such historic moments, the severance from the world of one's ancestors and childhood remains the original catastrophe. For as long as I can remember, we had in our possession the single first page of the memoirs that my great-grandfather Herman intended to write but never could. Here he relates how at the age of 17 he arrived at the train station in the Amsterdam Weesperstraat to find refuge in the Jewish quarter. When my grandmother died, we found a box containing at least 40 similar first pages, started at various points of his life. Time and again, he returned to the same moment, never able to move beyond it. His mother's house in the shtetl and his arrival in Amsterdam on a January morning of 1917. This for him was not the start of a story of proletarianization, even though he joined an association that professed to unite workers. In Amsterdam, he managed to establish a small business of the most quintessentially Jewish nature, gathering, repurposing, and selling schmattes, scraps of old leftover cloth. He actually did quite well out of this, although he never managed to make the jump from independent commodity producer to capitalist. Neither did his new life allow him to forget his point of departure. In the margins of his rather primitive sheets of bookkeeping, he kept returning to the source of his trauma. But there's something else here. Despite all he had gone through, Herman kept on believing foolishly but stubbornly in the possibility of a better future for humanity. In that light, the resilience in holding on to pasts eradicated by dispossession, war, or slavery also represents a form of hope. Catastrophic episodes of reconfiguration of the stream of accumulation might be inescapable starting points and results of capitalist development. But that does not mean there is nothing before them or beyond them. In the past 25 years, I have thought and spoken many times about the themes that I have brought up in this lecture. Until fairly recently, I would never have thought I would speak them here, on this occasion, and in such outlandish clothes. There are many more people that I need to thank for this than I have time to mention here. First of all, I would like to thank my students. You are a much greater source of intellectual stimulation than you probably think. Faith, Jules, Nout, and David, in my tutorial on the origins of capitalism, were a highly critical test audience for the ideas presented here today, as were the students in my course on land grabbing and many who went before them. My PhD candidates at the VU and ISH, Sam, Tsuyi, Zaudi, and Eva, inspired me daily, while I've also continued to learn from Tamira at the ISH, Martin at Harvard, and Dominique at the VU. I'm deeply grateful to the Executive Board of the VU and the Dean and Faculty Board of the Humanities Faculty for granting me the honor of this chair. I want to extend this gratefulness to my directors at the ISH, Leo Lucas and Karin Hofmeester, who allowed me to stay associated as senior researcher for 1 day a week. I thank my predecessor, Karel Davids, for first welcoming me to the VU, and Suzanne Lejeune, Paul Neri, Petra van Dam, as well as countless colleagues and members of the faculty's supporting staff, for making my first year as chairholder feel natural and easy. Katja Antunes, Michiel van Groese, Lucas Poi, Wim Manuhutu, and Nancy Jouwe, your support during the application meant more to me than you can imagine. You wouldn't tell from the rituals, but academia can be quite a hierarchical place. I was exceptionally lucky throughout my career to encounter mentors, role models, and friends who accepted me as an equal and co-thinker. This list can, of course, only start with Marjolein het Hart, my daily PhD supervisor. I also want to make special mention of my last-minute PhD supervisor, but ongoing intellectual exam, Marcel van der Linden. Among the many, many others who belong on this list are my dear friends at Pittsburgh, Marcus Rediker, Nicholas Frickman, and Pernille Reu, Sven Beckert at Harvard, Tithi Bhattacharya at Purdue, Anthony Boakes at Brown, and Rafa de Vivar Marques at the Universidad de São Paulo. I was fortunate as a young student to land up among a group of like-minded, critical, radical, learned, and committed people determined to bring about social change. A significant number of them are still among my closest friends and continue to be movers and shakers wherever they landed up. Maina, Miriam, Jelle, Hilde, Peyman, Gabri, I still want to dance with you after the revolution. My mother and father, Daisy and Sander, my brothers, Tono and Raoul, my grandparents and great-grandparents provided me with a loving environment that valued learning, but did not care too much for titles and academic achievement. I am sad that on 7 April this year, my grandfather Mau passed away. He is dearly missed. Floor, ik ben heel blij dat je hier bent. Anything I could say in this setting to my soulmate Willemijn and my children Sammy, James and Nina would be trivial. You are both the origin and the aim of everything I do. Ik heb gezegd.
Thank you, Pepijn, for this thought-provoking and also emotional lecture. Thanks a lot. And allow me to start my brief response with a memory that came back when I read your text. It's a memory about your grandmother, Miriam Oehringer, and her story about the importance of the Yiddish translation of Das Kapital for her father and herself during the German occupation. You shared with us this family story because somehow it keeps resonating in your academic journey. My link to that opening of your convincing and thought-provoking lecture is that in 1979, as a 24-year-old student, working at my MA thesis and my doctoral scriptie on the illegal press during the Second World War, we interviewed many former resistance fighters, and Miriam Oehringer was one of them. So last night, I searched for my notes from 1979. And it then struck me in those notes that I just briefly wrote down the facts she told us. Some facts, actually, answers to our questions, and some words that indicated just a tiny little bit of the full life stories behind those answers. I was a student, and I wanted to get the facts right. And maybe she and the others who also wanted us to get the facts right wanted to talk to us for that reason, in order to reconstruct a history beyond later ideological splits. But regardless of my meager, matter-of-fact notes with almost casual remarks about severe things that happened to people, catastrophic things, I still vividly remember her and also her classes, and how grateful I was that she wanted to talk to us about that past which we hoped to reconstruct as it had been. What you convincingly have shown us in your lecture, Pepijn, is the value and the importance of source criticism. The art of source criticism that does not lose itself in a critique of an interpretation of a source, but that keeps returning to the source itself. And that approach gives a double meaning to the central notion of original in your argument. Original accumulation, yes, but also the original text. And the implications of the first and then English translation of ursprüngliche Akkumulation original accumulation into primitive accumulation, implying an earlier underdeveloped or starting stage of capitalism, a translation that not only impacted on the analysis of academic thought, but also strengthened the notion of progress with its full acknowledgement of colonialism. You invite us to think with you about this notion of original accumulation beyond the capitalist notion of progress, in order to arrive at a historically informed understanding of how the economic dynamics of capitalism are rooted in colonialism. Original, then, is not as an early stage of capitalism, but it is a historically recurring phenomenon that still happens and which comes with destruction, dispossession, and human suffering. You call them original catastrophes in human lives that occur time and again for the people concerned. They make and they block their memory, as in the case of your great-grandfather, who despite everything did not lose a certain trust in the possibility of progress in the sense of a better future. Thanks, Pepijn, for sharing these insights, motivations, and outcomes of your work. What your lecture, with its many historical references, points us to is that revisionary histories, and with this I do not mean in an ideological sense revisionism, but a revisionary interpretation of the past, that such histories are invoked by and confront us with the present. Thank you. Having said this, we arrive at the end of this meeting, and I have just two more announcements. First of all, I would like to thank those who have followed this ceremony via the live stream. And then I would like to ask you, when we start leaving this room, to give priority to those seated in the front rows, so that they can leave directly behind the cortege, and then you will follow, and there will be drinks. And then finally, in order to come to the formal formula that ends this ceremony, I would like to ask you all, if you wish, to stand up. I close this public session of the Council of Deans. May our search for truth and wisdom be of service to the flourishing of the world and humankind.